Section 2, Building a Muslim Empire. The focus question is, how did Muhammad's successors extend Muslim rule and spread Islam? By the end of the section, I can explain how Muslims were able to conquer many lands, identify the divisions that emerged within Islam, and explain why the Muslim empire declined. So the key terms, people, places: Caliph, Sunni, Shia, Dome of the Rock, which you'll find on page 311, Sufis, Baghdad, and Sultan. So if we look at that first objective, how did Muslims conquer many lands? This isn't really a very easy process because immediately after Muhammad's death, he never officially named a successor, and a bit like when we talked about the ancient Roman Empire, that there was no real clear method on how to choose a successor. And so they go through this bumpy period where they're kind of trying to figure this all out. Eventually, anyway, Caliph is someone who was a political successor to Muhammad. And they overcame these early problems. His father-in-law actually took over and pointed out the fact that if you worship Muhammad, Muhammad's dead. If you worship God, God is always here. And through that, he exerted some leadership in United Arab Tribes. So if we look at the reasons for success, you got to go to page 312 for this, because for whatever reason the book I don't think goes in very good order in this particular instance. But if we go to 312, they mention a couple different things. One is the Byzantine and Persian empires. They'd been at each other for a long time. The other thing is the Byzantine Empire is still trying to recover from the Fourth Crusade. They're both kind of weak, so there's this power vacuum. It's just looking and sucking someone into the region to kind of be more powerful. The other thing is for a long time, several hundred years, and for the Persian Empire, maybe even thousands of years, they had been exerting their control, and people were just tired of it. They were looking for a change, and so they kind of welcomed this change, and they kind of hoped that maybe this Islamic empire would be somewhat different and maybe offer them opportunities they hadn't had before. On top of that, you have these bold, efficient fighting methods that are employed by the Islamic Empire. They're very mobile, they're very quick, they're on horseback. So all of those things make them a pretty lethal fighting force. And on top of that, you have this religious zeal, this enthusiasm to spread their beliefs and their way of life. And they really believe that what they're doing is in the best interest of everyone. So, and another reason is when you look at how they dealt with conquered people, they were able to kind of come up with an efficient and somewhat inclusive system for ruling over these conquered people. If you were a non-Muslim, you paid a special tax. They allowed Christians and Jews and even Zoroastrians, the people who believed in one God, to continue to practice their faith. So they showed some flexibility. So if we look at the split, describe the differences between Sunni and Shia Muslims. This all stems back to the death of Muhammad. There's a debate in the Islamic community on who should be the leader. For Shias, they believe that it needed to be some kind of a direct descendant of Ali and Muhammad's daughter Fatima, or a direct descendant of Muhammad. And they believe that these people were imams or divinely inspired, just as Muhammad was. This is a very small percentage of Muslims today, about 10%. They live mostly in Iran and Iraq, but there's a pretty sizable population in Lebanon and Yemen. Not that they're not other places, but those are where the biggest ones are. There was another group that kind of formed that believed that any good Muslim could lead. And what kind of comes out of this debate are the Sunnis, who are kind of this compromise group. They make up 90% of all Muslims in the world today, so this is by far the biggest. They kind of believe that a good leader from Muhammad's tribe should become caliph or political leader, but they also believe that the inspiration for leadership comes from the example of Muhammad. It doesn't have to be a direct descendant. It just has to be someone who can follow kind of the lead set by Muhammad. And the split still remains today. So if we look at a place like Iraq, Iraq has a pretty sizable Shia population, but for most of its history it was ruled by the minority Sunnis. So even though the Sunnis make up the vast majority of Muslims in the world today, they were a pretty small group in Iraq, excuse me, and that's where Saddam Hussein was a Sunni, and the Sunnis kind of ruled over the Shias, and that kind of led to these bitter rivalries. So their core beliefs are all the same. They follow Muhammad, they follow the 5 pillars of faith, they read the Quran, but they differ slightly in religious practices and daily life, and so that wouldn't be that much different than Christians today, where Lutherans and Catholics and Baptists and Presbyterians all share the core ideas of Christianity, but they differ slightly in religious practices and how they live their daily lives. So that's pretty common. And a third group eventually forms the Sufis. These are mystics. They end up being a bit like Christian monks and nuns. They help spread Islam to some remote areas. So they talk about a couple different dynasties. We're going to focus on the Abbasid dynasty just because there's really 2 different dynasties that form. One is heavily influenced by the Arabian Peninsula. The Abbasid has more Persian influences, and so that would be Iran and Iraq today, where they're outside of the Arabian Peninsula. So originally, the Islamic faith was on the Arabian Peninsula, and as it spread outward, it kind of diversified and picked up other influences, and Persian happens to be one of the biggest ones. Under the Abbasids, they moved the capital to Baghdad, and Baghdad still is an important cultural center. One of the things that happened during the Iraq War was that some of these important religious buildings and relics were destroyed or stolen, and so Baghdad kind of contained these things from way back. The other thing that happened under the Abbasids, it became a more diverse and inclusive faith, and that's going to kind of serve a little bit to be part of the decline of the Islamic Empire. What eventually happened under the Abbasids is control of the empire kind of fragmented into different states. So for example, Egypt broke away and became their own independent Islamic state, and then you have that happening all throughout the Islamic Empire. But it's tough to rule over a diverse empire, and the rapid growth really didn't help. The Roman Empire took hundreds of years to spread out. I mean, it took 100 years just for Rome to take over the Italian peninsula, let alone be able to grow into the enormous empire that it was towards the end. The Islamic Empire, all within 200 years, grew from where it was in Arabia all throughout most of the Mediterranean world. So it's really tough when you have that kind of fast growth. And so that's one of the problems, the fragmentation, trying to rule over a diverse empire. At the same time, you have outside forces again. They're going to play a role. The Seljuk Turks are growing in power. They come from Central Asia into the Islamic Empire. They end up adopting Islam, and sooner or later they take control over Baghdad, and they have a sultan who's a ruler who's ruling over Baghdad and whatever is left of the Islamic Empire. And the Mongols do the same thing. They come in and they take over. Eventually they kill the last caliph. They also adopt Islam, and despite that they continue to take over the region, and that pretty much puts an end to the Abbasid dynasty, although we'll talk about the Ottoman Turks and their Islamic Empire later on in a different section.